Good afternoon, everyone. Today's lecture will cover the Crimean War, the largest European conflict between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War. The Crimean War was the culmination of a decades-long struggle between Russia and the United Kingdom, Europe's two strongest powers in the years following Napoleon's defeat. Russia and the UK had been heading towards confrontation for many years. A key site of tension was Asia, with the British fearful that Russia would invade India from the north and conquer their rich colony. As the Russians colonized the lands of Central Asia, the British expanded from the south, with no fixed border between the two empires. This began the so-called Great Game, in which Britain and Russia both fought over the Central Asian borderline, using proxy wars rather than outright confrontation. For example, the British invaded Afghanistan in the 1830s, although this invasion was repulsed in a bloody defeat. The Russians were wary not only of a British invasion of their south, but also of the British stirring up an uprising among the Muslim population of Central Asia that the Russian Empire had recently conquered. The British and Russian imperial games in Central Asia developed into a genuine rivalry and then hatred between both Brits and Russians. The British prided themselves on their protection of individual liberties and their advocacy of supposedly modern principles such as free trade. They saw Russia as a backwards place run by a cruel and expansionist Tsar whose superstitious religion threatened to plunge the world into darkness. The Russians tended to see the British as mercantile opportunists, obsessed with wealth, who wished to expand their own influence around the world to exploit it for their commercial gain. Both sides envisioned a world war which would decisively end the power of the other, and a number of causes, such as Polish independence or the restoration of a Greek empire, became attached to both sides. Whilst the British perceptions of the Russian people as a whole were coloured by Orientalist, even racist, stereotypes and arrogance, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas I, was indeed both an extremely autocratic and an extremely religious ruler. Coming to the throne amidst an attempted liberal coup in 1825, Nicholas was deeply suspicious of all ideas that hinted at liberalism, allowing reforms only in the area of administration. These hatreds only increased after the failed revolutions that swept Europe in 1848 and that Nicholas's armies helped to crush. Meanwhile, Nicholas further strengthened the power of the Tsar by centralizing the chain of command in Russia and expanding the secret police. Secret police were tasked with monitoring the state of political opinion and to track down and repress all political activity that might be considered dangerous to the regime. The bureaucracy in Russia was massive and poorly paid. Loyal service was encouraged towards the person of the Tsar themselves rather than to the state, and rank and status were all important. Now, to his credit, Nicholas disliked serfdom, but he did nothing to abolish it, fearing the instability that this would cause. The Russian court and educated opinion in the country more generally was divided between Westernizers and Slavophiles. These groups were not, despite their name, formed of those who liked and did not like the West. Rather, they were divided by whether they embraced radical reform or a conservative solution to Russia's problems. Westernizers pointed to Russia's sluggish industrial growth, its lack of infrastructure, and the corruption of its bureaucracy, and argued that the country needed widespread reform in order to keep pace with the rest of the world. Count Sergei Uvarov, Minister of Education from 1833 to 1849, for example, encouraged a freer intellectual atmosphere in Russia, albeit one that excluded the lower classes. Slavophiles looked to Russian history for inspiration. They believed that there had once been a happy partnership between the Tsar and the people. The Tsar had consulted the people through their elected spokesman, This had been changed by Peter the Great when he sought to copy foreign models and interposed an alien bureaucracy between himself and his people. The Slavophiles believed that Russia should return to the way it was before Peter. They asked not for a parliament, but rather a consultative assembly to advise the emperor, which was still too much for the absolutist Nicholas to accept. The Russian Empire had also begun a slow and patchwork process of the Russification of its various subject peoples. Russian theorists argued that all people within the empire should subsume themselves into the dominant Russian culture. Measures were particularly targeted against the Poles, who Nicholas hated. The treatment of the Poles angered Western, particularly British and French, public opinion, who also disliked the expansion of the Russian lands. Whilst fear of a Russian invasion of India were unfounded, Russia had fought a number of victorious wars in the early 19th century, in Persia, the Caucasus Mountains, and against the rebellious Poles. It became clear that the next battleground would be the Ottoman Empire. As the empire grew weaker, Russia began to compete with the British, French, and the Austrians, either to gain influence over the Ottoman state or to conquer pieces of it. Romantic Russians even dreamt of a restoration of Christian rule to Istanbul. Without a doubt, Orthodox Russians saw themselves as protectors of the Ottoman Empire's Christian subjects, a concession that had been granted in international law. Heading into the 1850s, Russia was interested in expanding its interests in the Ottoman Empire to both mask some of its serious internal difficulties and to protect Christians living there. The British were determined to stop them, and some British subjects even dreamt of a world war in which the Russian Empire would be dismembered entirely. Both empires were expansionist, and both were flushed with prestige. Both largely believed in the infallibility of their own armies. France was the third major power involved in the war. The French Emperor Napoleon III sought to stabilize his power base at home by restoring French grandeur and pride. He publicly spoke of France's authority over the Christians of Palestine, threatening Russia's claims on a spiritual level. When the Sultan refused to grant Napoleon the privilege of being the protector of the Palestinian Christians, the French emperor sent a warship to the Mediterranean and forced the Ottoman ruler to change his mind. Events quickly escalated from there. The Russians mobilized their army along the borders of the Ottoman Empire in today's Romania, which was then known as the Danube Principalities. Tsar Nicholas demanded that the Sultan give him the role of sole protector of all of the 12 million Orthodox Christians who lived in the Ottoman Empire. The British ensured that the Sultan didn't back down, just like they had defended him against the Egyptians in the 1830s. The Russians then responded by marching their army into the Danube Principalities, and the British and the French dispatched a naval task force to much acclaim to support the Ottomans. The Russian invasion went poorly, and the invasion force lost over half its men. Combat was not the primary cause of death, but rather disease, amplified by the Russians' poor supply chain and the rudimentary nature of their medical services. The Russians did, however, destroy 11 Ottoman battleships that lay in anchor in the port of Sinop. In response, and egged on by enraged public opinion, Britain and France officially declared war on Russia in March 1854. Both sides were confident of success. The British and the French considered Russia's armies to be technologically backwards and poorly organized. The Russians were confident in both the size of their army and in the support of the Austrians. In 1849, Nicholas had saved the Austrian Empire by sending in his army to crush a Hungarian uprising. Now he expected Vienna to repay his support. Yet the Austrians were worried about the Russian armies that had invaded the Danube Principalities, an area that they wanted in their own sphere of influence. They joined the British and the French in calling for the Russians to leave the area. In June 1854, the Russian government accepted the Austrian demand that the Russian troops be withdrawn from the principalities, and in August Austrian troops entered to keep the peace. The presence of Austrian troops both benefited Russia by preventing French and British forces from marching on Ukraine, and damaged Russia by preventing its troops from marching to Istanbul. The Tsar nonetheless resented the Austrian action as showing ingratitude toward the power that had saved Austria from the Hungarian rebels. From now on, Austria and Russia would be enemies, not friends. Britain and France, meanwhile, had directed their joint army to the swampy port of Varna on the Black Sea coast, where it was picked at by mosquitoes and disease. There they are, the French doing nothing and the British helping them as fast as possible, wrote Karl Marx. After the Russians withdrew their forces from the area, the British and French might as well have gone home, as their original aim was now accomplished. However, the public back home had been whipped into such an anti-Russian spirit that to end the war now was seen as inconceivable. With the British and the French unable to march north due to the Austrian garrison in the principalities, they decided to send an expedition to Crimea to destroy a large Russian naval base in the city of Sevastopol. The two countries' armies landed at Calamita Bay in September 1854 and were confident of a quick victory. In a worrying sign of things to come, the landing did not go smoothly. Many of the men were already sick with cholera and had to be carried off their boats. A lack of equipment for moving supplies meant that parties had to be sent out to steal carts and wagons from the local farmers, who had at first welcomed the invasion. The only food or water for the men was the 3 days' rations that they had been given at Varna. No tents were offloaded from the ships, so the soldiers spent their first nights without shelter, unprotected from the heavy rain or from the blistering heat. The British, French, and a small Egyptian contingent eventually organized themselves and marched south towards Sevastopol, defeating a Russian force at the River Alma. The Russians were entrenched in a defensive position, but the Allies had the advantage of their rifles, which could fire further and more accurately than the Russians could. Both sides then embarrassed themselves in the aftermath of the battle. The Russian retreat was manic and completely disorganized, whilst the Allies failed to pursue their opponents and continue marching south. If they had done so, Sevastopol would have been captured within a day. Both sides abandoned their wounded, lacking the medical facilities to care for them. Men were left dying in the field for days with little care whatsoever. The Allied armies, having no idea of the casualties that they had just inflicted upon the Russians, slowly marched southeast to circle Sevastopol. They established temporary bases at Balaclava and Kamiesh and began to siege the city. In October, the British and the French began a large but inefficient bombardment of Sevastopol from both land and sea. As the Allied forces were weakened from cholera, the Russians sent out a large force to attack Balaclava and separate the British from their supply lines. A joint Ottoman and British force held the Russian attack at bay, with the Thin Red Line of Highlanders holding off a Russian cavalry attack and entering British folklore for their bravery. As the Russians attempted to leave the field, a mixed-up order from the elderly British Field Marshal Baron Raglan resulted in the British light cavalry charging into a valley of Russian riflemen who were protected by artillery from all sides. The subsequent massacre of the British cavalry was immortalized in the Tennyson poem The Charge of the Light Brigade, written 6 weeks later. Balaclava had revealed that the Allies' siege lines were too long and thin to be effective, especially as more and more men died of disease and of exposure. The Russians attacked again in November at Inkerman, where a thick fog made command impossible, and soldiers fought with each other pretty much one-on-one. The Allies once more won an impressive victory against a larger Russian force, and then they once more failed to exploit it, the Russians retreating back to Sevastopol and the siege continuing. The subsequent winter was brutal, and troops lacking appropriate winter clothing froze to death in their tents. A ship carrying winter clothing was destroyed along with 29 other transports in a storm, and its cargo was lost. The war became unpopular in Britain, with ordinary Britons angered at the government's series of fiascos. On the 21st of January 1855, a snowball riot occurred in Trafalgar Square, Manchester, in which 1,500 people gathered to protest against the war by throwing snowballs until they were beaten back by police. The Prime Minister, Aberdeen, resigned soon after, replaced by Lord Palmerston, who dreamed of not only continuing the war, but also of creating a series of uprisings to destroy the Russian Empire from within. The Ottoman army, meanwhile, regained its self-esteem and prestige by defeating a Russian attack on Eupatoria, whilst the Tsar, deeply morose over the war, died of pneumonia in February 1855. The Allies repeatedly attacked Sevastopol in the summer of 1855, but their bombardments had been effective, and each assault was repulsed with extreme loss of life. The British had by now lost so many men to starvation, disease, the cold, and battle, that their numbers were largely replaced by French, Ottoman, and newly arrived Italian troops, with Sardinia entering the war in January. Eventually, in September, the city fell and the Allies destroyed the Russian fleet and dismantled the port's fortifications. Sevastopol had held out for 337 days when it could have been captured on the very first. Meanwhile, a Russian offensive in the Caucasus had gone well, and the Ottoman fortress of Kars fell in November 1855. The Ottomans were denied the chance to transfer men from the Crimea by the Allies until it was too late to do anything useful. After another brutally horrific winter, the two sides signed a peace agreement in March 1856. Russia was to return its gains in the Caucasus and demilitarize its Black Sea coast so that its navy could no longer pose a threat to the Ottomans, but in return it did receive back the towns that the Allies had taken. The Danubian principalities effectively became free, paving the way to an independent Romania. Overall, very little on the surface had changed, and the terms certainly came short of those Palmerston had dreamt of. And yet, despite being a massive waste of life on most levels, the Crimean War was significant in a number of ways. Constant defeats in the war deeply hurt Russian prestige, the son of the Tsar stating that "we are both weaker and poorer than the first-class powers." The fact that the British and the French had simply been able to invade part of Russia and destroy the entire Russian Black Sea fleet was a humiliating experience, and efforts to modernize everything from infrastructure to the education of the Russian infantry was undertaken for security concerns. The shock of the war helped the next Tsar, Alexander II, to abolish serfdom altogether in 1861, just 5 years after the war had finished. The enforced demilitarization of the Russian navy in the Black Sea would last only 15 years, until the fall of Napoleon in France denied the British of their ally. Having betrayed the Russians' trust, the Austrians were now left alone in Europe without an ally. No one came to Vienna's aid in the subsequent wars in Italy and with Prussia, resulting in a large loss of territory for the Habsburgs and their fall from the ranks of the greatest powers. The British gained little other than a weakening of their enemy and a series of new national myths. The war came to define British patriotism in the Victorian era, and improvements were made in military supply chains and in medicine. France achieved a great deal of prestige. The Ottoman Empire was given a brief 2-decade period of respite before Russian attacks continued in 1877.